welcome. Perhaps the most controversial figure in the liberty movement is Murray Rothbard. Of all his controversial views, and there are many, the most controversial view perhaps is his view on children. So today we're not going to, it's not going to be a gotcha moment. Haha, Rothbard wanted to sell children. No, we are going to try to do justice, first of all, to the position, and then we will criticize it based on something rather than saying what a horrible position. We might end up to the conclusion that it's horrible, but we're going to investigate it. And we're going to do this with someone who not only is knowledgeable on the philosophy of Rothbard, actually knew the person himself. So we're with James. And you were telling me, James, you knew Rothbard for 3 years. Not that it is important for discussing his ideas, but it gives an interesting, like, you can tell us a bit more in terms of what was he thinking, having these views.
I have to confess that when I was a teenager, I had such a promiscuously wide open mind that, it was actually Nathaniel Brandon in Beverly Hills who I brought up the issue of Murray Rothbard first with, and he said, well, you can find no better, it was Brandon who said you can find no better economist out there, but beware, Jim, if you ever study from him. I moved to New York, started studying at New York University to study philosophy and history. And it was there that I got to know him. And for 3 years, got to know him pretty well. I bought him pizza on his birthday one day. And we became quite friendly together. When the Ludwig von Mises Institute had its first annual gathering in Washington, D.C., he invited me to come down there. I went down to DC, took the train from New York down to DC, thought I'd hide in the corner because I was just a college undergrad at the time. Murray Rothbard cuts a beeline across the giant ballroom over to me, sits at my table, and suddenly I'm meeting Ron Paul and Congressman Phil Crane and everyone else associated with Austrian economics. So yeah, I knew Murray Rothbard.
Okay. So now let's get to the point. So his opinions on the issue of what is the status, let's say, of the rights of children can be found in The Ethics of Liberty. Again, perhaps the most controversial part, chapter 14, Children and Rights. So he sets us the stage as following, saying, look, a newborn, a child cannot possess proper self-ownership. It would make no sense. So he says it's a potential self-owner. And then he says the question is when, at what point does he become actually the self-owning? So when does a child acquire the right to liberty and the right to self-ownership? So he takes the child throughout all the phases. He takes the child while it's inside the mother. And for example, he's for abortion, not on moral grounds, but on the grounds that it's the expulsion of an invader. Let's leave aside the abortion debate and let's get to when the child is born. Let's discuss the discussion from there. So he says that when the child is born, because it doesn't make sense to say it has self-ownership at that stage. It says the mother is the only one, the natural and rightful owner of the baby, he says. So let's start from there. Before we even get to, how do we make sense of this? So the child hasn't got self-ownership, is only a potential self-owner. And when the child is out, the mother is the only possible self-owner. She's like, who else could it be? The state, someone else? So it has to be the mother. Till this point, are we good? Is there anything shady here?
Oh boy, do we have a problem here from the outset. Human beings are not property. And one of the problems, conceptual problems, I know there's contexts in which you can use the concept self-ownership analogously, but my mind and my body is not my property, it's me. And I think we need to make a very careful distinction. And when we're talking about children being owned, children, in one sense, are not property at all. It is true that parents, and I would include more than just the mother here, but you see, Rothbard is attempting to avoid any kind of legal monopoly that might come in here. So he's trying to create this free-form natural right that we're all just supposed to come to accept because he doesn't want any legal standards imposed. But children are not property any more than slaves are property. You can't abuse your child physically. You can't deprive your child of physical necessities. A child is not, technically speaking, anybody's property. It is the responsibility of the parents who brought it into this world. Thank you.
And would Rothbard disagree? Because here's what he says then. He says, so it's better to say that the mother is a trustee. So say the parental ownership is not absolute, but it's the ownership of a trustee or of a guardian. And then he puts two more important conditions. So he says this property is limited in time. So, you know, your mother cannot tell you when you're 50, hey, you are not allowed to go out. But also, it must be limited in kind, which means it's not an absolute. So they cannot torture you, they cannot kill you. And so it's a guardianship. In other places, he says it's an ownership, which is limited in kind and in time. And here starts the interesting stuff. Mm-hmm. Although, as you said, there's already some shaky ground, but here's it. He says the very concept of rights is a negative concept. You only have negative rights, which mean keeping people away. So, of course, he says the parent has no right to torture you or to kill you. But, he says, you don't have any right to compel someone in any positive act. For example, you don't have a right to quote a living wage because this means that someone has to take a positive step. And here comes the bomb.
Right.
So no man, he says, may be saddled with the legal obligation to do anything for another. And you hear that and you say, yeah, okay, makes sense. But this means that, quote, the parent should not have a legal obligation to feed, clothe, or educate his children. No legal obligation to feed, clothe, or educate. Of course, in the next line, he says, look, I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm not saying you shouldn't do this. So he says, I'm not making a moral case. I'm saying you don't have any obligation because no one's rights means that you have a positive obligation to do something for them. So this is the bomb. This is the most controversial thing. What's your comment on that?
That is utterly monstrous. Utterly monstrous. Not only do you have a moral right, but because of the physical impact on the child, you have a legally enforceable moral right. By bringing a helpless creature into this world, you obviously have the moral obligation. But more than that, you have physically endangered this child. Abandon a 6-year-old, it will die. It will die. Murray Rothbard is saying that you can in effect create this being and let it die and starve out there as a result of your physical actions, your volitional choices, and you've physically starved this child and it's okay. No, that is the initiation of physical force against someone who is innocent. That, I would argue, is coercive behavior against a child that the government can and must enforce. Absolutely. And see, this is exactly the kind of thing that Professor Rothbard always was trying to wiggle around and wiggle out of. But the monstrous effect here on actual human children is to, in effect, impose physical coercive force upon them against their will as a small, helpless child. I see it as no different than, say, a molester molesting the child, in effect. Only now the parent, you're the one who's brought them into this world. There's a basic minimum obligation that you have that must be enforceable by law. You brought a physically helpless thing into this world, and you have a legal obligation, in my view, to take care of that child until it can take care of itself.
So Rothbard, as if expecting that you would say that, he would say that if we consider the argument from helplessness, he says, then first we may take the general point that it is a philosophical fallacy to maintain that A's needs properly impose coercive obligation on B. So he says, okay, of course, but many people have needs. And then he brings the example. For example, what if the child is the result of rape? Or if your argument is that you chose to bring this child to life, what then if you are like not the first parent? Let's say, you know, the parents die and you're the grandmother. So you are a guardian, or you are a step parent, or you're a foster parent. So he says the argument from need doesn't make sense because no one's needs impose an obligation to everyone. And he says the fact that you chose to be a parent, doesn't stand because quite often it's not a choice.
No, well, this is one of the reasons why I'm very much in favor of birth control and abortion. It enhances that choice, but it actually is a choice. People do know the consequences, generally speaking. Now, it's true there are cases of ignorance, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have to have legal abortion. For example, it needs to be a consensual matter. But I would compare this to more to a contract situation. When a parent has brought a child into the world through its actions, through the adults volitional actions bringing this helpless person into the world, they stand in a different position than anyone else. It's as if I had made a contract with you. You gave me some money based on a promise from me, and that promise from me is enforceable by you by force of law. Again, all due disrespect to Professor Rothbard, that needs to be just as contracts can be legally enforceable. If I have made a promise, if that promise is a real contract with consideration, then that can be enforced. And in effect, there's a one way the analogy that I would draw here is that it's in effect a one-sided contract. When you bring a helpless child into the world, and even if all you did was to causally create the child, through sex, you are still responsible for the consequences of your actions. It was your volitional action that brought this helpless thing into the world. And you now have, in effect, it's stronger than a mere contractual obligation. It was a one-sided unilateral contract you sort of imposed on the child. And so it is a chosen obligation. When an obligation is chosen, like parenthood, then it is absolutely enforceable, and you can't ignore the need that you created in the child, the physical need that you created in the child now. Otherwise, it amounts to physical coercion against the child.
So you put emphasis on the you created, because later, in the same paragraph, Rothbard also presents the following objection. He says, if a helpless child may be said to impose legal obligations on someone else, why specifically on its parents and not on other people? So
I'm sorry.
That's how I've heard it from some libertarians. By the way, let's be fair here. The vast majority, even of anarcho-capitalists, disagree with Rothbard. But here's something that I've heard. It says, if you go out in the square, in the central square, and you shout, "Hey, central square, I'm leaving my baby here. I cannot take anymore, or I don't want to take care of it. Keep in mind, this is now helpless. Bye-bye." So does everyone now have a positive obligation to the child?
I would observe, in you going back a little bit to his example of grandparents and uncles and others who might be appointed the guardian of the child, and under the American and I think British legal systems, that is not imposed against the will of the person. We're not foisting the child onto someone other than the parent. The court will inquire, are you willing to do this? Are you up to this, grandparent? Are you up to this, aunt, to take care of the child? And the court isn't simply going to impose upon some exterior, some greater, larger family member without their consent. If no such person can be found, that's when they'll be sent to an orphanage, become a guardian of the state, and have a government appointed guardian, be put into foster care, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
At that point. So guardianships are not imposed without consent. The question is, was the obligation a chosen one on the part of the person to take care of the child? Once you've taken on that obligation, you absolutely have that obligation having been chosen. And since the child, in effect, can't respond, it's a unilateral one imposed on the child. The child didn't ask to be born, or who its parents would be, or who the guardian is going to be. It's being a one-sided, in effect, contract. I've agreed to take on this obligation, and the child can not in any way, let me put it this way, oblige him or herself yet in any way. It's a totally one-sided deal here. They have a one-way obligation to that child until that child can take care of itself. Now, you put it out to the community? No. Obviously, no one can thrust a child on you against your will. I can't have a kid and then say, Nikos, here's my kid, take care of it. No, of course not. Or even the community at large, here, take care of it. But I do believe that in a free society, and history, I think, bears this out, orphans will be taken care of voluntarily by benevolent people. There are a lot of people out there who want to have kids who can't. There are a lot of people out there who want to have kids and just love it and would want the extra kid and have devoted. That's in effect, my sister is among her whole career. She had 5 kids. She's got grandkids. She educationally prepared herself for it. Her career is to have kids. She would never allow a child to helplessly go out there. That would be a career goal for her, in effect, to take care of that child in a voluntarily chosen way. And I do agree to this extent. You can't thrust the responsibility of an unchosen obligation onto the community at large or onto someone against their will. That much is true. On the other hand, those who are responsible, those who did bring the child into this world through their actions, do have that one-way obligation.
All right. And the last question we're going to address is whether it makes sense to say there should be a market for children, which is another super controversial point that Rothbard makes. But let's leave this for the end. So one last thought experiment, like Rothbard throws, again, he foresees all these objections and he throws one last card on the table. He says, and he quotes someone else, but the thought experiment is that a child is very sick and the parents are very, very, very poor. And to be able to treat the child, the parents need to basically put their quality of their life to almost to oblivion, to zero. Could someone say that these parents still have so should they, I don't know, should they work 3 shifts every day to, of course, I mean, this is silly because you would expect that there would be the sympathy to these days, of course, there would be the state, but let's say even in a society without like a welfare state. But let's say that I don't know, they live in the middle of nowhere, so they have to become, quote, not slaves, but they have to work, they have to sell their kidneys, whatever. Do these parents still have an obligation to the child? So Rothbard throws this and say, look, now you have to admit that at this stage, you cannot expect them to die for the child.
Well, that really runs counter to my experience with all the parents, and in particular, the objectivist parents I know, who would happily starve, surrender something for themselves so they could take care of their child, even give their life for their child. So in my experience, the human nature is exactly upside down on that. People who are becoming parents for benevolent and selfish reasons are not like that at all. They are quite the opposite. And it is a transferable obligation. If the parent cannot, and so many, I've actually seen this in real life, if the parent can no longer take care of the child, they will ask the family for help or something. Hey, grandma, can you take the child for a while? I can't take care of the child. But there is an additional, leaving all that aside, the parents do have an additional obligation that can be legally imposed that isn't imposed against them. In other words, you can't force them into medical treatment if they have cancer, right? But I would force the parent to give what medical treatment they could afford to the child. I would do that. Now, would I cause the whole family to starve and die? There are limits to that, obviously. If the child can't be properly taken care of by these parents, then the court probably would look around. The court would look around for a guardian that might do better. Can we find a foster parent? Can we find a relative who's willing to take on that obligation? That would be a far more benevolent approach to this, I think, than what Professor Rothbard has laid out there.
Okay, so let's move to the next controversial issue, which is the argument that the child should be able to run away whenever it's physically capable for. So again, the argument is the parent is a trustee, which means that the parent, so Rothbard would probably agree with you, the child is not the property of the parent. So when you're a trustee, it means that there comes a time where your trustee duty is over. And Rothbard says, look, if we put anything artificial as a demarcation point when you're 18, where you're 21, he says that's artificial. He says the great industrialist left house when they were 12. Other people still live with their parents when they're 35. So here he says is the solution. So for the child has his, I'm quoting, his full rights of self-ownership when he demonstrates that he has them in nature. In short, when he leaves or runs away from home. And then he says the parents can plead, but they cannot force it back. Let me give you a personal example. When I was very young, my parents, I was 8. or 7 or 8. My parents wouldn't allow me to stay up after 9. But every Sunday, it was the early years of private TV in Greece. They would show Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone movies. And one night, I was like, I want to watch a Commando or Predator. So I went to my friend's house, which was the nearby, and I declared that I'm leaving house. Technically, I walked. I literally opened the door and I walked. Like 30 minutes later, obviously I was back home. But technically, I ran away. So Rothbard says that the parent in that case, if the child is physically shows that, okay, bye-bye, the parents has no right to bring them back, and actually bring them back would be violating the rights of children.
Yeah,
so,
well, you know, my wife, when she was, what was it, 6 or 7? She'll correct me, I'm sure. 6 or 7, decided she was going to run away, and she started walking down the street. She had, you know, the solid judgment to take what she needed, her teddy bears. And so,
I also took like 2 things.
right, exactly. I'm sure they were vital too. No, that is craziness. The whole
Why
idea,
though?
the child is not yet completely volitional. The child is not yet completely developed conceptually. The child has not reached the quote age of consent, as we say in law. The child's judgment. Look, I can be a physical reductionist if you want. The child's brain hasn't physically baked sufficiently. It has to go through puberty. It has to go through some maturation before it really understands and can make informed choices. And only when the child's full rational conceptual capabilities have kicked in does full volition actually kick in, and a child is now the quote the age of consent. The whole reason Rothbard said that the child is a trustee, and see, I don't even like that, frankly. The child guardian, I think, is a better word for it. But in any event, because you see, if I am just a trustee, an adult, let's say, I'm the beneficiary of a trust, I can always stop that. I have the right to say, no, screw that trust. I can
that exactly, says Rothbard. Exactly. So therefore, you should be able to have the same thing with the child, he would say.
No. This is more like a guardianship. If an adult person goes completely psychotic and starts becoming violent and crazy and hallucinating, then that person needs to have a guardian appointed over them, even if they're an adult. This analogous situation, I think, is for the child. We're talking about a human being with rights. On the other hand, because their conceptual faculty is so impaired, they need, or not yet fully developed, they need a guardian to take care of them and to make those choices. And so, no, children cannot sign contracts legally. No contract signed with a minor is valid. Boom, no contract at all. They can't vote. There's all kinds of legal restrictions. Parents should be the ones making the medical decisions. Parents are the ones who we impose on these requirements for physical safety, well-being, feeding them, clothing them, making sure they're okay. And you can do that precisely because they are the guardians of the well-being of this child. Conceptually, it just seems to me that Rothbard has gone down this really artificial, bizarre path with.
But he would also say that 18 years old is also artificial.
Obviously, human beings will develop to the age of consent at different levels, but there is enough of a norm. There is enough of a regular pattern here that we can say, hey, wait a minute, 15-year-olds I know are, no. 20, 21-year-olds I know always are. Somewhere in there is when, obviously, there are 16-year-olds I would trust with their own decisions better than their parents, than 30 or 40-year-olds. But that's not the question. It's not a question of my assessment of their judgment. But the point is, it's a more objective thing to say, when are they conceptually prepared to take charge of their own life? That is a relatively objective matter. And so I would argue to him, no, actually setting that is while there's a range, there's certain arbitrariness, the range itself is an objective one. And somewhere within that range, the law is going to have to set it. And by the way, a proper legal system would also have a means of an emancipation. That is to say, if a 16 or 17-year-old can take care of itself and the parents are letting down on the job, the kids can go to court and say, hey, I want emancipation. I want to be like an adult and take care of myself. So long as we have some wiggle room there, what we've done is we've accounted for the narrow range that I think is within an objective range of maturity. But that's exactly what Rothbard's trying to avoid here. A single objective standard and procedure.
Okay, so let us now, in the remaining 5 minutes, reach the final argument, which is also super controversial. So Rothbard says, if a parent may own his child within the framework of non-aggression and runaway freedom that he's already discussed, then he may also transfer that ownership. So you own your car, you can sell your car to someone else. He may give the child out for adoption, or he may, emphasis his, sell the rights to the child in a voluntary contract. What do we make of it? If you can give a child away for abortion, can you also sell it? Can you put it on Amazon?
That is absolutely horrifying to me.
Sorry, not morally though. Morally, he would say, I agree. Legally, should you be able to say, look, I don't want it anymore. I'm poor. Take my child for whatever amount of money I see fit.
I think that the government, when it comes to this sort of thing, when it comes to the guardianship of a child, the government needs to actually have oversight over this. It is absolutely critical, or we're creating a market in slave labor. There are going to be people out. I mean, look at the, I'm in favor of legal immigration, but look at the cartels and the way they're treating people because of this semi-black market in humans that's going on at the US border. There are people who are absolutely being abused by the system. Child labor, child slavery, sex slavery, the abuse. I mean, we're opening ourselves up to that if we're really going to approach this like anarchists and we're going to be able to sell children on the market. No, the government has to be the one looking over and making sure that this is a person who's going to look after the interests of the child, which is what the parents' original obligation was. The parents' original obligation was to take care of that child. If they're going to transfer that obligation comes with all the bells and whistles that they had on the child. And that requires, in my view, government oversight. Court should be the one to say, no, the transfer of the guardianship from the child goes from person A to person B if the guardianship of the child needs to be transferred. We can't let the government away from this at all, and we need a single objective standard to determine these things. Otherwise, we are creating a terrifying situation out there.
On a utilitarian point of view, if someone wants to sell their children, I think the child would be definitely better off with anyone else. Okay, not anyone else, like not with, I don't know, a monster, but with 99% of the population. Not necessarily because they're bad parts, but maybe, they're poor. Maybe they know they're gonna die in 3 months. So there might be reasons. So if you can give it away, why can't you sell it? That's the argument.
And all other things being equal, someone willing to buy the child is probably wanting to do it for benevolent reasons, but that probably is the whole thing. And are they accepting the full responsibility of taking care of the child that the parent had? They would have to be assuming that, and that would have to be legally enforceable on the person to whom it was transferred. Does Professor Rothbard have anything about that in there? See, that would be my great fear. My great fear is that when you transfer by mere selling, is there any kind of legal oversight on how the parent takes care of the child and how they have to take care of the child legally? How the person to whom the child is transferred has to take care of the child legally? Do they have, for example, they have to feed and clothe and give minimum medical attention to that child as any parent would? These will be the vital questions that are, I think, left totally unanswered by Rothbard. And it's the imposition of those obligations. How do we impose the obligations of parenthood or whoever is assuming the guardianship of that child voluntarily? How do we impose that on the person without a government, without a state, without a single legal standard? How do we do that, and how do we do that justly? I think that would be impossible.
So my bet with myself is always to go no more than 30 minutes. I'll just throw this out as my last word. Obviously, I play devil's advocate, but here's how I see it. The problem with most of the views of Rothbard that, as you shown, they're not compatible with what actual individual rights are, is that they don't begin with, let's say, an inductive process. They begin with this idea that of a priori and of deduction. So it's like, if this, then this and this and this and this and this and this, which is the praxeological method. And actually, if you see Hoppe in his introduction to the ethics of liberty, he makes exactly this point, and he makes this point as being Rothbard's strong point. But actually, this is not Rothbard's strong point, because individual rights are not something that you follow a deduction, and individual rights have a very specific have raison d'etre.
Exactly right. That kind of a priori deductive approach that is Rothbard's explicit method that rationalism is going to ignore the facts of reality, and it's going to ignore all of these horrors that seem to me to be opened up by his proposal here. And will reality get in the way of a rationalist? No. I can ignore whole swaths of reality if it conforms to this beautiful castle in the sky, this chain of deductions that I have that supports my view.
And to make it clear to,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, to make it clear to our viewers, think about his, in my view, even crazier view about individual right, about individuals having the right to own nuclear weapons. And here's the deduction: everyone should have the right to do things if they haven't harmed anyone. Property rights is the building block of society. Owning nukes is compatible with property rights. You haven't released them to anyone. Therefore, anyone should be free to have nukes. This is the essence of rationalism, that, it makes sense in my deductive system, therefore, thumbs up.
Right, right. And, he wouldn't have a government. He would have competing governments in effect. And of course, he believed in total proportionate justice. If I cut off your arm, you have the right to cut off the other guys.
It's here.
If you torture him, you have a right to torture him. This rationalism leads Rothbard to all sorts of, in practice, in reality, all kinds of horrifying ideas, the implications of which, to me, are, as I say, horrifying.
Okay, so we've run out of time. Many thanks to Jeff for his support. Let's also make a couple of announcements. Tonight, 10 p.m. UK time, TV Talk with Mark, Pellegrino, Zax, and Jennifer. The TV series they're discussing these days is Lost in Space. And a special announcement tomorrow, 4 p.m. UK time. ARCUK is starting a new course with Joseph Tabenkin on the history of astronomy, from ancient Greek to Kepler. And the first session will be available to ARCUK members, and all the following sessions will be platinum level exclusive. So this is a closed elite level access course. So James, we put some things on the table that could be the discussion in future episode, the nuclear bombs, the private ownership of nukes, for example. Many thanks for today's points. And our producer today is his birthday. And what better gift can we give him than to ask him to do some extra work, which is to break today's episode with the exact claims and to cut it in YouTube, how it's called, chapters. But hey, happy birthday, dear producer. Happy birthday, Daniel. You're making our life easier. You're always there. This guy creates thumbnails in like 2 minutes. So you're doing great work. So thank you very much. And you share birthday with Karl Marx.
And may I just amplify that? I rely so much on our brilliant and hardworking producer, Daniel, and I want to thank you so much. You are instrumental. You are part of the wind beneath the wings of all of those who are attempting to fly here at ARCUK. Happy birthday, Daniel, my friend.
Happy birthday, Daniel. Thank you very much. James, many thanks to everyone, to those of you who watched, to those who contributed. We really appreciate it. Have a great weekend and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.